Jai Hind and welcome to Dev Talks. This is Aadi. Narrative, information, and propaganda. Something that we are hearing quite a bit, especially since the start of the Russia-Ukraine war. We know there is a certain action that goes around. Governments do this as a policy. It is a part of warfare. But how is it structured? What is this all about? We know about propaganda, but we don't know the actual structure that goes behind it. To understand this, I have someone who really has a deep understanding of this subject of cognitive operations. Lieutenant General Dr. R.S. Panwar. Sir, thank you so much once again after a long time on Dev Talks. This is a big subject for people to understand because I guess it will help us understand what's happening in the world and what happens with us a lot of times.
Thanks, Adi. It's always great to be on your show. And as I see you, you're doing a wonderful job on Dev Talks.
Thank
And
you, sir.
Jai Hind to all your viewers. And I hope I also find this topic very interesting. And it's what is catching up
Yeah.
the imagination of people all over the world, especially those in the carrying out strategic operations. And so let's hope we have a nice interaction. I'm looking
Sure, sir.
forward to it. Thank you.
Let's kind of begin with a perspective on national security, and I'd like to start with a thing which is happening around. If you look at the Russia-Ukraine war, as I mentioned in the introduction, you have a certain narrative that is coming out of the West, and then you have a certain narrative which is coming out of Russia. Very small, very minuscule, but that's a different story altogether. We see attempt by the West to kind of draw the world towards their narrative by readdressing the same things over and over again. Uh, we've seen this happening to us also, sir. In India, we've had these issues wherein we have had, if I may use the words, fake news, misinformation, disinformation, which is campaigns that have been run. The biggest question people want to know is, sir, one, how do we decipher with this entire thing? How do we know that this is a campaign or a fake news game which is being played with us? And a lot of people don't understand why would you want to get involved in this sort of a campaign when wars are normally fought in the battlefield. I guess the understanding of the fifth generation aspect of it or the hybrid aspect of it is something that we all need to understand, sir. So how would you like to kind of put all of this in perspective?
Yeah, that's a great question, as always, Adi, and it's extremely important that we understand where it all fits into in the overall national security perspective of any nation. So, this question will sort of contextualize cognitive warfare, what we normally understand as narrative warfare, disinformation. All these words are being used, especially in connection with the Ukraine conflict. We are seeing these words floating around. But really speaking, it's a very complex game, and it's part of an overall strategic actions which a nation takes against its adversaries. So let's try and contextualize it first before we go further deeper into the subject. And for that, I would like to share a couple of slides.
So
Right. So, what you see on the screen is what is referred to as the DIME paradigm. Now, the DIME stands for diplomatic, information, military, and economic. These are the four pillars of comprehensive national power which any nation uses to impose its will on other nations, especially its adversaries. Now, if this be, and we can relate it to what is happening in the Ukraine. So, for example, diplomatic initiatives are actually not being taken to the extent they should be taken. Now, you see Prime Minister Modi, etc., have made some statements, and French are doing something. So, they are the diplomatic aspects. Then there is the economic aspects. All these sanctions which the West is imposing, that's the economic angle. You have the military, In any case, here the military refers to the kinetic portion of military operations, the standard traditional battles of land, sea, and air. And then you have this information component. Now, our cognitive operations, narrative warfare, disinformation, etc., really falls into this information component. Within this, now, if we try to analyze it further, the ones which I have indicated in blue, these are also referred to as the non-kinetic operations or non-kinetic elements, whereas the traditional military where bombs and bullets are flying, that is the kinetic element. So the military element is the kinetic element. Now, within these four elements, since we are in Dev Talks, so we should be focusing on armed forces roles. In any case, armed forces, the primary role, the military, the kinetic operations are the primary role of the armed forces. But in the information domain, while this is a whole of nation affair, armed forces also carry out information operations, and we'll refer to that as military information operations. So it's a whole of nation, but armed forces have a significant role to play. And you also have a military diplomacy component within the diplomatic element of it. So this is how the whole comprehensive national power is exerted by a nation to impose its will. That's the primary aim, to achieve what? To achieve politico-military objectives. Now, what is happening is over the last couple of decades, because of the increase in and this information operations, well, I'll refer to, there are several elements to it, but I'll refer to, let's say, the cyber aspect of it and the cognitive aspect of it. They are two separate elements. This, because of the digitally connected world, the more and more the world is becoming digitally connected, social media, and so on and so forth, its power is increasing. And
Hmm.
because of that, we are talking of these days of the importance of non-kinetic operations, and these words which you used in your question also, hybrid warfare. So what is hybrid? It's a hybrid between kinetic and non-kinetic elements of national power, a combined use of kinetic and non-kinetic. Earlier also there used to be these. After all, there were sanctions earlier too. There was diplomacy earlier too. It's really this information component having becoming more and more potent in their effects that we've started talking about hybrid warfare. And so, we talk of hybrid warfare. Unrestricted hybrid warfare, incidentally, is a US term. Unrestricted warfare is the Chinese equivalent.
Hmm.
New generation warfare is the Russian equivalent. So all these terminologies are coming to the fore now over the last couple of decades because of information element, and within that, cognitive element is a very, very important part of it, which is what we are going to talk about today. So now, and of course, let me also point out that we have, the spectrum of conflict. So we have peace and gray zone and all-out conflict. So we are
Hmm.
actually
Hmm.
in a gray zone. And while of course the Ukraine conflict is an all-out conflict which is going on, while we, India, China, vis-a-vis China, India vis-a-vis Pakistan, we are fighting a gray zone warfare all the time. So, what I wanted to bring out here with reference to cognitive operations is that within the information elements, it's the cognitive element which is most important in the gray zone. Cyber warfare is also important, but cognitive warfare is the most important element in the gray zone, because kinetic operations are not really, it may also take place during the gray zone. So, for example, we have the low intensity conflict going on in Kashmir. So, that's part of kinetic. But really speaking, the cognitive element is the one which we have to focus on while we are in the gray zone part of the spectrum of conflict.
Hmm.
So this is the first part which I wanted to bring out, and then I also want to relate it to armed forces specifically. So when armed forces get into the picture, we talk of multi-domain operations. We talk of these five domains: land, sea, air, the traditional three domains of Army, Navy, Air Force, and space. And then you have the cyberspace. Now, if cyberspace, so where is cognitive in all this? Cyberspace, really
Cyber.
speaking, is should be understood. It's meant to be understood as information space. That's how this
Yeah,
word
of
cyber
course.
was
Hmm.
originally
Hmm.
designed.
Yeah.
And so, just to just to tell you as to when, because a lot of people talk of multi-domain operations, but we get confused as to where is all this narrative warfare in this multi-domain operations. So I just wanted to bring out, it is this cyber understood information which actually is a combination of cognitive warfare, cyber warfare, and also electronic warfare. So this is how I would relate it, right from comprehensive national power to how armed forces get involved. This is where cognitive warfare falls in the overall domain. Just one more slide I'll share on this first one to bring out. I mean, there are three elements, like I said. Electronic warfare, we'll not talk much about that, which is actually in the EM domain. It uses EM
Hmm.
energy.
Hmm.
You
Hmm.
have cyber operations and you have cognitive operations. Now, what are cyber operations? Cyber operations are those which use malicious code to target informations, to disrupt, destroy or information systems. Whereas
Systems.
cognitive operations, the weapon is the message which targets human minds. Now, why I'm bringing out this is that, really speaking, this narrative and disinformation, etc., which we talk about, is actually a combination of cyber operations and cognitive operations,
Cognitive operations. Hmm.
which we will talk about a little more. But I just wanted to bring out this distinction that one should not think that anything that is happening, for example, a WhatsApp message floating over, you're trying to give out black propaganda or something, is not really cyber operations per se. But the entire game which is being played is a mix of cyber and cognitive operations. So we leave it at that, and
Sure.
from that we can proceed further deeper into cognitive operations.
So that's
Just
a.
share.
I mean,
Yeah.
you've brought out a very interesting point, and I must say there is a misunderstanding, if I may, or there is a, I guess it's a lack of clarity that comes around when you brought out the difference between cyber operations and cognitive cognitive operations. Because the minute somebody says cyber ops, the first thing people come to mind is, yeah, Twitter trends, Facebook
Absolutely.
videos, and this and that and the other. But I think there is a little bit of a line difference. Part of the same domain, if I may take that word from this thing, part of the same game, but holistically different in the way it is being used. So that, I think, is a very interesting point that you brought out, sir. But this is, these cognitive operations in terms of targeting of the human mind has been a concern to a lot of people and a lot of countries today. Uh, if we look at the example of Europe, a lot of people will agree with me that, they've been dragged to something probably they don't want to do. Keeping that aside, sir, but there is also a domain of warfare where the armed forces would try and influence, or you know play a game of cognitive warfare. How do you see the role of armed forces coming into the sort of a this entire domain? And one extra thing that you mentioned is this has to be a whole of nation approach. It's something which is very interesting to me, because today everything has to be a whole of nation approach. So there's nothing that can be done in a silo with today's connected world. So how do you kind of again put this whole thing together, sir?
Right. As you very rightly brought out, that there is two cognitive operations. There is a whole of nation element, and there's an armed forces element. How do these two fit into each other is what we have to now figure out. So first, I will try and focus on what the armed forces, in what way are armed forces involved in this entire game. Now, the way to look at it is, there are types of cognitive operations which are carried out in support of military operations. Whatever cognitive operations are required to be carried out in support of military operations, that in any case uh, are primarily the domain of the armed forces, because they would carry it out, because they are carrying out, it's a multi-domain operation, so they are supposed to carry out. But there are cognitive operations which can be carried out independently of any military operations and still achieve strategic effects for a nation.
Hmm.
So, and even when military operations are going on the side, there would be certain types of cognitive operations which will be carried out by the non-military, non-armed forces agencies also. So there, like I said, there are various issues involved. So right now, first I'll focus on What are these types of operations which the armed forces need to carry out in support of military operations? And I'll just bring up one slide to show that. Right. So there are five components of this military. I'm calling them military cognitive operations. Five elements are there, and these five elements are conceptually all different, which in brief I'll try to explain. So first element, as you see on the screen, is psychological operations. What are psychological operations? We actually tend to refer to the entire cognitive domain as psychological operations, but really
Mostly,
speaking,
yes.
now you'll find out the difference. There are different elements, and all are not so-called psyops. I'm being a little definitional just to bring out, because unless you use the right words, you can't really distinguish as to what is happening and who's supposed to and how you're supposed to do it, and what is the capability which is supposed to be made. So I'll bring out these differences first in the context of military operations. So, first element is psychological operations. What are they meant for? They are meant for attacking the will of the adversaries so that their will to fight is reduced. That is the aim of psyops. So, whatever you do to attack the will of the adversary falls under psychological operations. And another characteristic of psyops is that it can, after all, it's part of war. So you can
Correct.
use disinformation, you can use deceit, it can be based on untruths, it can be based on black propaganda, those, that sort of a thing. There's a devious element attached to the subcomponent of military cognitive operations, which is termed as psychological operations. In contrast, you have something called public information.
Hmm.
One can call it, uh, you know, what you do through mainstream media, through broadcast media. Now, if you are giving out true, now the difference between this and psyops is this is supposed to be based on credible information, on truths. So you are trying to portray to, okay, the one point about psyops is that is carried out against enemy combatants and maybe hostile populations. So that's the target of psyops. You don't carry out psyops against friendly populations or domestic populations. Whereas public information, the media, so to say, broadcast media, whatever you do through broadcast media has to be credible information. Because if you start resorting to untruths there, this also can be referred to, okay, I'll not use that word. So it has to be credible based on truth. And it is meant for your domestic audiences, it is meant for international audiences, and also it is meant for hostile populations, so all types of audiences. So the difference
True.
is it's based on truth, and credibility is important, because the moment you lose credibility, the effectiveness of that will go. So that's the second element. The third is military deception, which is quite different from psyops. Now, military deception is also carried out against enemy combatants. So essentially, it is all the devices that you use, all the proceed, I mean, steps that you might take to deceive enemy commanders as to what is happening on the battlefield. So you can make out that's quite different from psyops per se. It is making him think wrong decisions by painting a picture of the battlefield environment which does not match with reality, so that on the military battlefield you achieve successes. Next is military diplomacy. Now, military diplomacy is, of course, fairly clear. That's also what the armed forces do. That may be in the gray zone also, that may be during combat operations too. And then you have civil military operations. What are civil military operations? They're also quite different from the earlier four elements. Civil military operations are actually activities. It is not messages which you're generating as a narrative or something. It is an activity which conveys a message. As an example, uh, for example, in the J&K sector, we used to, I think these days they're not using the word sadbhavna. So there was a big
Yeah.
sadbhavna operation
Yeah.
which we used
True.
to carry out for doing what? Like, for example, running
Hearts and
schools
minds.
and
That, yeah.
football matches and getting people from there students, etc., to visit parliament, etc. That's a picture that you see. Group of girl students meeting the prime minister. So that's all part of Sadbhavna operations. What are we doing that for? So in an area where counter-insurgency is going on, it's part of the hearts and minds, winning hearts and minds, paradigm, which I'm sure most of people have heard. So this is what is civil military. In some, in a single clause, it can be stated as actions which convey meaning in aid of support of military operations.
Military
So, as you
operations.
can
Okay.
see, if you look at these five elements, each of them are conceptually different. They've got a different aim, and each has to be progressed accordingly and expertise developed accordingly. So, if you just say, okay, cognitive operations, one doesn't understand what exactly the whole thing means. One tends to get confused between one stream and the other. If you look at each of the subcomponents, you understand that yes, within military cognitive operation, there are different approaches to doing things, all in support of your achieving your military objectives.
There's a whole lot which has
Yeah.
been brought into the paradigm, if I may say. And the second point that you mentioned about credibility, I think a lot of people will relate to that in terms of fake news peddling. I mean, if I may use that word very clearly, a lot of media channels and stuff like that have lost their credibility because of unverified footages and news. So I think it relates quite a bit, sir.
In fact, if I can add there, you can see, I mean, whatever happens, let's look at it to Ukraine, that you see entirely two sets of media. One is Russian, and of course, it's friendly media, which may be there, including in the US. There are certain media things which are pro-Russia, and then you have the Western media. Now, when you listen to that, after this several months of war, that you don't really believe either side because both have lost credibility.
Yeah.
Both sides have lost credibility. They are not giving a balanced output, and so you have to discern, between the lines. You have to read to find out what is the truth. So if you lose credibility, the power of the media is lost. If a media is balanced, people will listen to it and get convinced. Okay, this is a factual thing, but
Yeah.
that's not what is happening in connection with the Ukraine war. So credibility is extremely important when you're using the mainstream broadcast media.
So you've brought out the armed forces actions. Having said that, let's keep an example of the Russia-Ukraine war. We see certain activities which are being conducted which are beyond the armed forces domain, and I'd like to explain that by giving a simple example that the Russians were supposed to be running out of missiles somewhere in March or April, and this is being said, then said, then said, then said, then said. So this is a operation which is basically away from the uh, military operations. This is to influence probably the Western public or the public of the world in general that the Russians are losing the war. Effectivity of such campaigns comes into question, sir, when these campaigns are blown apart, right? And we saw that in multiple occasions. The Ghost of Kiev, a fighter pilot that was supposed to have shot 40, this, so on and so forth. There are multiple examples of this particular sort. What I want to ask you is, sir, what goes in behind creating a comprehensive campaign? Uh, because what we see today are more knee-jerk reactions to these campaigns in terms of trying to influence and this and that. So, how does one actually set up a campaign of cognitive operations which may or may not be related to the military, sir?
Sure. Now, I would like to answer your question. At the outset, I would like to say that uh, when we are carrying out, firstly, the first point which I would like to reiterate once again is that cognitive operations during the gray zone are more effective. And as kinetic warfare breaks out, the effectiveness of cognitive operations to achieve objectives on their own or potency of them recedes somewhat into the background. That's one,
Mm.
but not that they are not potent. You see, today
Mm.
also,
Mhm.
despite all these activities, cognitive operations are playing a role. There are certain ends to
Yeah,
which it is. That's the
indeed,
first point
indeed.
which I want to make.
Mhm.
The second point which I want to make is that it is a complex affair. it is, some people feel that okay, you think of some narratives and peddle those narratives, and that's what cognitive warfare is all about. It is not that. It requires development of expertise of a very high level. That means people trained as graduates, postgraduates, doctorates. That's the type of level of expertise. In which disciplines? In cyber disciplines on the one hand, and cognitive disciplines on the other. And the interplay of the two is what leads to an entire cognitive operations domain. So I'll elaborate on that, right? So expertise, that is a complex affair. There are many dimensions to it. And to explain these, I will again take on a couple of slides.
Sure, sir.
Right. Now, this slide may look a little complicated at first look, but really speaking, I'll just highlight a couple of aspects to it. See what you see, the green circle and the yellow circle. Really speaking, we are talking of influencing. So you have all types of influence operations, and then you have cyber activities, as I call it, the big yellow circle, cyber activities,
Hmm,
which
hmm.
means in cyber activities, there is a subset cyber operations, the orange circle, that's the cyber operations. So if you are sending, for example, a simple message over WhatsApp, that's an activity in cyberspace. So it's a cyber activity, but it's not a cyber operation because it's not using any malicious code or something. It's not hacking in colloquial terms. But if you use a code to, for example, hack something to be used for cognitive operations, now that would amount to cyber operations because you're using cyber expertise. Hacking is, in colloquial terms, it is hacking, but really speaking, using malicious code to hack something. I'll give examples of that. Right. Now, influence operations which do not use cyber expertise. A simple example, you a narrative being peddled over what in a WhatsApp group. There's no cyber expertise required there. You're it's just a WhatsApp group and you're sending out a narrative. It's happening through cyberspace. That is referred to as cyber enabled social influence operations. It relates to the word social media, etc. Social influence operations. While the ones which do use cyber expertise in influencing using cyber expertise in some form or the other are referred to as cyber enabled technical influence operations. If you see the intersections of the circles, I'll not go into too much detail. These are the two types of differentiated, all under cognitive operations. Both are cognitive operations, but one does not use cyber expertise and the other uses cyber expertise. So let me give you an example of one which uses cyber expertise. So you've heard of the 2016 US elections, where it is widely believed that Russia, the hack and leak operations which took place, the emails of Hillary Clinton were hacked. So that hacking required cyber expertise. That's the first step. And in a second step, those hacked expertise were targeted to a huge amount of electorate, so to say. And many believe that this is because of this hack and leak operation that Hillary Clinton lost to Trump. It's as good as a regime change which has occurred because of cognitive operations. You see? So, this second time, so you're using a two-step process. In the first step, cyber expertise. In the second step, uh, using that to influence people. So this is an example of the second type, cyber-enabled technical influence operations. So this is what this slide is about. That really speaking, one must distinguish. And then, of course, there are influence operations which have nothing to do with cyberspace. So, for example, if you're just carrying out pure diplomacy, that's also an influence operation, but that is not in cyberspace. So all these circles are meant to sort of bring out this aspect that there are two elements to it. So we should not call everything is cyber operations are taking place. No, some of it are cyberspace operations, others are not. Okay, now let's begin to get on to some more specifics. Now, I said that it is cognitive operations are a complex affair. So there are large number of techniques and stratagems which are involved in carrying out cognitive operations. And I'm only right now I'm showing only a few of them. So under techniques, So there's something called psychographic hacking, disinformation, false identities. These are three of several techniques which are there. What is psychographic hacking? Psychographic hacking is that you are targeting, you can target whole populations in one go through broadcast media. If you send out a message in a broadcast media, then everybody is listening to it, but you can target a section of society. So, for example, a particular group you can target, or you can target individuals. So, when you're targeting individuals, it would be referred to as very targeted psychographic hacking. So, this is
Okay.
what happened in, for example, the Cambridge Analytica case. That
Yeah.
large number of Facebook profiles were first hacked, and thereafter dark ads, something referred to as dark ads means to people depending on their political inclinations, targeted messages were sent to the electorate to wean them over to whichever side was wanted to be weaned to, so tilt their political influence so that they vote in a certain manner. That was what was done in Cambridge Analytica case. That incidentally, some of it was related to India also. I mean, I'm not going into
Mm,
those
mm.
details.
Yeah.
So, psychographic hacking, so there are different levels of targeting. It's what brings the first point. Then we come to disinformation. So, there's a, for example, a difference. One must understand the difference between disinformation and misinformation. One must understand the difference between um, black propaganda, gray propaganda, and white propaganda. Because if we don't understand these differences, one wouldn't know how
How
to
to fight them.
utilize these different types of propaganda in various scenarios. Uh, what is the difference between disinformation and misinformation? Disinformation is deliberate distorting information to propagate a certain narrative. Misinformation is inadvertent, that some information is put out which is not verified, but it is not intentionally thing. So that's what is made. These are some of many of it are definitional, but one must understand the nuances.
Mm, mm.
Black propaganda has got a deceitful element behind it, and it's based on lies. White propaganda, like I said, is based on truth. You may make a narrative based on truth, your own side of the story, without going into untruths. So that's white propaganda, and gray is everything in between. So there are various nuances. Then, of course, you have false identities to be created. You have all this AI, videos and audios being made. So AI is a great enabler of cognitive operations, incidentally. So I'm just trying to bring out certain, as an example, I already given this Cambridge Analytica as an example of psychographic hacking. So similarly, there are stratagems. What's the difference between a technique and a stratagem? A stratagem is a combination of techniques to achieve a particular end. That's the difference between a technique and a stratagem. Just a moment.
Okay. Mhm.
Right. What you so for example, I've given the example of hack, mix and release. I've given that example in connection with Hillary Clinton. So you have hack and release. You can hack, and whatever information you get, you can distort it. That's called the mix part, and there's a release part. And you can use various types of techniques to achieve these types of things. So this is what so the aim of this slide bringing out is that I've just listed out two or three of each types, but actually speaking, the whole range of it. And the whole idea to bring out this in our talk is to bring out the complexity of the entire affair, right? Now, there is also another element to this entire cognitive operations thing which we are talking about, and that is what is being referred to as I mean, there's a famous quote by Dr. James Giordano. Uh, this is being practiced by it's goes like this: the brain will be the battlefield of the future. Now, this is utilization of neuro weapons for carrying out cognitive operations, so to say. So we can delve into it a little more, but I'm saying there's another facet to it, more
Mm.
other than what I just talked about, military operations and whole of nation approach, etc., and the complexity of the entire affair. Now, having said that much, let me also bring out a couple of other points in this connection that I've already brought out the aspect of specialization. So You require specializations, as I pointed out earlier, in cyber disciplines,
Yeah. Hmm.
not for carrying out proper cyber attacks against critical infrastructure or something, but for carrying out cognitive operations. So, what sort of cyber expertise do you require? So, I've given an example of hacking is one. What about botnets? Botnets is a very potent means of carrying out cognitive operations. What are botnets? You create a set of botnets, a small set of people, and actually the botnets are the one which is it is acting as humans, giving their opinions. So that is what is botnets about. So hacking as an example, botnets as an example, and other types of cyber expertise which is required to propagate cognitive operations. So that's one type of expertise. Then you come to cognitive, the actual narrative, what we refer to as narrative generation. Now, to carry out in an effective manner, you require, what all disciplines? You require knowledge of geography, history, sociology, psychology, something called as
Culture.
cyber psychology.
Hmm. Hmm.
So,
Hmm.
whole lot of this entire set of expertise on the cognitive side is based on arts disciplines, whereas the expertise required on the cyber side is on the ICT disciplines. They are two different groups of people. They are not from the same background, but there has to be a mingling or a synergy between two sets of experts to carry out effective cognitive operations. So it just doesn't happen like that. So specialization is a very important aspect which we, unless we understand this, we'll, because unless we understand this, we'll not create the right organizations and will not have the right talent to man those organizations to carry out these cognitive operations in the right manner, right? So one also comes to the aspect of, it flows from specialization, and it also flows from charters. That which other, you talked of whole of nation affair. We talked of what military is supposed to do in terms of support of military operations. But when we are carrying out cognitive operations against societies, now let me give an example here, related to, let us say, India. So we'll come to the ethical aspects of the example which I'm trying to give right now, a little later. But let me give this example. So you have, for example, this Gilgit Baltistan. There are disgruntled populations there, and you have Sindh, and you have Balochistan, right? Now, when we are talking of cognitive operations being carried out in the gray zone to achieve strategic effects, essentially one of the aspects which we are looking at is making use of societal or communal fault lines in the adversary state, exploit those fault lines to achieve your political objectives. Ultimately it's all political objectives which you want to achieve.
Hmm.
So
Even
you
war is,
try
sir.
to,
Yes.
yeah, even war is a means to achieve political objectives. So that's why I didn't use military now, because now I'm talking of those cognitive operations which you can carry out in the gray zone without the use of military, by carrying out pure cognitive operations by exploiting societal fault lines. So, for example, we want to Uyghurs, for example. That's a disgruntled population in China, and I've given you two examples from Pakistan, right? If we have to peddle, you so to say, peddle the right narratives to make it happen, if India as a nation decides to do it, I'm just saying, ethics we'll talk about later, but as an example, I'm saying that if India decides to do it, then what will it have to understand? Let's take Balochistan or Sindh. What will have to understand? It has to understand the entire psyche of the population there, the
Hmm.
history, the geography, and how to target the entire affair. So it's a whole complex affair which has to be done. But if we want to keep Pakistan destabilized, a lot of people are propagating this, that we should be doing it. After all, they're doing it to us. Aren't they doing it to us? You see all this Khalistan in the news, Canada, etc., etc. Who is this being funded by? It's being funded by adversities only, right? I'm sure you heard the news about the Khalistan referendum, the second referendum, which Dimashi has been given to the Canadian, diplomat here.
Ambassador, yes, sir.
So, ambassador here. So all these anti-India, okay, what about farmers' operation? What about the hijab controversy? Why did it bloat up? They're all being funded. I mean, there were no issues there. So you heard of celebrities coming up and battering India, anti-India bashing. So many things are being talked of in the media. So adversaries are doing it to us. Should India also do it to its adversaries, or should it just stick to a moral stand? So that we'll discuss next. But I'm just saying, the point which I was trying to come to is, which are the right agencies to do this? Now, that's actually an open question. So, first, we have to decide as a nation, do we want to do this thing? Okay, there's another angle to it. I'm talking the offensive part right now, that if others are doing it to us, we should give it back to them. Now, that's a question which has to be answered first at the national level, and thereafter, who's to do it. The other part is protecting against these cognitive operations. How do we protect our own population in the non military context, the entire population, or the vulnerable segments of the population? And in the military context, your combatants against the military cognitive operations of the adversary. There's a question of protection. So, how do you go about protecting your own personnel against the cognitive operations being carried out by the adversaries? So that again is is a non-trivial capability which needs to be developed. After all, it's the entire. How do you protect an entire population? So I'll give you some examples. If the government is banning certain apps, why is it banning apps? Because they are propagating, and certain accounts, etc. It is approaching Twitter and YouTube, etc. to ban certain accounts. Why is it doing it? It is an anti protection measure against the cognitive operations of the adversary. But this is actions which government, certain actions are being taken out. But I'm just bringing to the fore the importance of developing the right expertise for defense against adversary cognitive operations. That is one part. And the other is to develop offensive cognitive operations capabilities, keeping in mind the ethics part of it. So that is the second angle. So which agencies are to do it, and how do they develop capability? The specialization I talked about are all open questions. I'm sure people are struggling with these questions, not only in India, they are struggling all over, including in the US and other places. They're all struggling with these questions. Russia has achieved quite a lot. In fact, it's the best known for cognitive operations. The word information operations is normally used as a synonym of cognitive operations, whereas actually speaking, information operations, like I brought out, technically speaking, correctly speaking, it involves three types of activities: electronic warfare, cyber warfare, which cyber warfare per se, if you attack critical infrastructure, is nothing cognitive operations about it, and cognitive operation. The slide which I showed brings out the clarity. So, so what I'm saying is that major all major parts, because it's a new phenomenon which has emerged because of the increasing digitalization of societies. They're all becoming more and more digitally connected, and so the information power of information becoming so potent that it is being used in a negative manner. And so we have to look at our own offensive capabilities as also defensive capabilities, and the whole world is struggling with it. And this aspect of the battle brain as a battlefield, it's got two elements which we'll talk about a little later. So it's all to do with developing capabilities. I'll stop there. I think a
Um,
longish.
Indeed, sir, it's an interesting answer. But one thing that caught my attention is the talk that you're talking about influencing the brain. So that is basically, uh, if I may speak loosely, it's basically affecting someone without him realizing it. How does that work? Because that's something which wherein, I mean, you can talk about fake news, you can probably bust it down and create campaigns against it and stuff like that. But how does neurotechnology, you know gain an edge? I mean, it evidently, by just the name of it, it gains a huge edge, as you've explained. But how does this thing go forward, sir?
Yeah, so that's the other facet of cognitive operations. But let me, before I go on to the details of that, as against what we've talked about so far, whatever we have talked about so far is current, it is happening, and it has to be,
Mm.
it is very much capabilities need to be developed as of yesterday, so to say, right? But as far as cognitive neuro weapons are concerned, a lot of research is going on. But as we'll see the types of things which you're talking about, it is situated, the real effectiveness will come to the fore sometime in the future, maybe 5, 10, 15 years from now. That's when neuro weapons, effective use of neuro weapons will come into the picture. Not that they have not already been used. So I'll just elaborate on that a little. And so, again, a couple of slides to illustrate my points. Right. So, this slide, what it shows, it is a overview slide. It shows that, and it is showing competence as of now on both sides, blue as your own and red as the adversary. So, you have two elements to it: information weapons and neuro weapons. Information weapons is what we were referring to so far, the message going in various forms, all these techniques and stratagems and etc. etc. All those military information operations which I talked about, all had to do are in some form or the other. They're all based on giving a message, as I brought out in that first slide, message being the weapon. The other part of cognitive operations is neuro weapons. Now, what's the difference? You have the brain, the message is consumed by the brain, and it is influenced to act in a certain manner. That's how a message works. Whereas in when you use a neuro weapon, you're actually targeting the process of the brain itself. So as a quick example, I'm sure you must have heard of the Havana syndrome.
Hmm.
The Havana syndrome was, diplomats in Cuba and Canada and other places faced a lot of discomfort,
Yeah.
for several months, etc. So it is widely believed that neuro weapons were used for this purpose. Um, Either sonic weapons, ultrasonic weapons, or microwave weapons. It's not very clear. It's not emerged very clearly, but neuro weapons were used to affect processes in the brain. So this is a quick example of what I'm meaning. That you're targeting the brain so that it cannot function to its correct capability. So that's one part of it. There is another angle to neuro. It's not really weapons, of using neurotechnology to gain a competitive edge, and that is to enhance your own human potential. One is that you're trying to degrade the adversary human potential, as I'm indicating on the right, and you can also enhance your own human potential beyond their existing capabilities. A quick example would be what we refer to in sci-fi language as creating super soldiers. So this super soldiers creating is also based on neurotechnology, so to say. It's called neuroscience and technology, and that's where we come to. Okay, another aspect to it. That one is, of course, you target competence. You can also target societies. Now, how societies are going to be target information weapons? In any case, we've talked about how information weapons can be used to target societies or groups within societal groups within societies, right? Would neuro weapons be able to target entire groups or larger groups? Now, that's a question to be seen as development goes on and R&D goes on. In certain manners, we can think of, and we'll come to the examples. But remember, there are two types of things we are talking about. One is in support of military operation to target combatants, and one is to target entire societies. Coming to another aspect to it, this is just a, you can say, for better understanding. Now, actually, the term cognitive warfare, is being used in a conceptual form, is being taken to the fore by NATO in many of its current studies which are going on. And there's a debate going on that rather than calling it the cognitive domain, because cognitive has to do with the brain, an individual brain. That's what cognitive is about. The word cognitive, it's all more semantics than anything else. Whereas, as we've discussed, really speaking, I gave the example of, for example, the Baluchistan example or the Gilgit Baltistan example, that if you are influencing people through, for example, social media, you are that person is embedded in a society. And so as a human embedded as part of a society, so it's the human embedded in society which becomes the target, and not just his brain per se, not an individual brain. So that's the point which and people are using this argument to say that we should really be talking of adding not a cognitive domain to the several domains of warfare, but a human domain to it. So that's just a point to be kept at the background. Now, coming to the actual technologies. So, neuroscience and technology, people talk of the NBIC technologies. The NBIC is an acronym for nanotechnology, biotechnology, information technology, and the cognitive sciences. Now, my intention is not to go into very great detail, just to give an overview of what is happening. And in very briefly, uh, there are five elements which emerged from it. To for understanding from a remembrance point of view: drugs, bugs, toxins, devices, and data. This is how it is put. So these are the various elements of NBIC technologies. So, what are drugs, for example? Drugs are, I told you, enhancing your own combat potential. So, for example, if you give drugs to soldiers so
Hmm.
that they can increase their wakefulness during high intensity battle, uh, that means you can, keep awake for, let's say, a week at a time. So, that's an example of using drugs to enhance your own combat potential. Another method of drugs would be you give drugs to the opponent. So, for example, truth serums is an example. If you've got a soldier and you give him a truth serum and he's spelling out secrets, so to say, that's an example. There are many examples which can be taken. Bugs relates to biological warfare. So, biological warfare which targets the brain, that sort of a biological warfare which targets the brain. So that's one. Toxins is another example. So if we've heard of the sarin attack in Tokyo subways, etc.
Yeah.
So it's a nerve agent. So any type of nerve agent which is actually attacking the neuro system, your neuro system of the humans, that comes under toxins. I would like to focus on devices. Now, devices is, I gave the example of Havana syndrome. That's an example of microwave devices or ultrasonic devices being used to target the brain. Again, neuro effect are being felt. Another example of devices in human machine interfaces. I'm sure many people have heard of Elon Musk's Neuralink. So,
Hmm.
brain machine interfaces where the brains will directly interact. It's a two-way interaction. You can extract information from internet directly. The brain extracts information, and the brain can direct through the directly through an interface things happening in the outside world. Not through your physical senses, but directly from the brain doing it. And for that, many projects are going on, and Neuralink is a great example of Elon Musk, which people have heard because Elon Musk is so popular, right? So that's an example of human machine interfaces. That's an example of devices. Two types of devices I've talked of so far. One is one is the third type of device, nanotechnology. So nano is also mentioned there. So where does nano come into the picture? So you have research going on where you inject nanoparticulates into a human, which are then directed to certain portions of the brain so that the brain can get affected in a certain manner. What you would do through let's say, through drugs or bugs, so to say. You do it through nanoparticulates. And such nanoparticulates, you can even, I mean, research is going on. I told you it's a little futuristic. Research is going on where you can disseminate these nanoparticulates in the atmosphere and humans consume it just like biological warfare. And thereafter, you can use other means, other, let's say, um, electromagnetic means in general to affect the brain. So all these areas, I'm giving you snippets here and there. In fact, I don't claim to be an expert on this, but this is a complete area where huge amount of research is going on. And to give an idea of the type of activity which is taking place, is this slide is meant to explain that there is an international brain initiative in which participants, the three major nations which are pursuing brain projects. The very first one is US's DARPA. The second is China's brain project. And the third is European Union's brain project. So there are three major projects, but there are other nations which you see here: Korea, Canada, Australia, Japan. We don't see India here. So all these nations have got together to have some synergy in development, but that synergy cannot of course be complete because a lot of things are going to be classified. There's a non-classified areas where people have got together, and there's an international brain initiative which has been started. I'm saying things, activities are happening at that level. So one must understand that it is not something which is just happening in some research lab. People are spending billions and billions of dollars to advance this. And in the future, this is going to play a significant role in cognitive warfare. This is what I wanted to bring up.
That's quite a scary picture that you put across, sir, because it's not something that a lot of people are even talking about.
Yeah.
Um, it is basically beyond the realm of I would say a common person's understanding. But he will be subject to this entire thing. So that's a little bit of a uh, this thing. You've actually spoken about super soldiers. You've spoken about you know all these kind of things. Uh, the biggest question that will come across is not about how they will be used or how they will be made or this and that. Are there? I mean, I don't know if till a while ago, even putting fake news on social media was considered legal, right? But today it's just there. So what? How do you think the ethical and moral lines kind of blur into this game, sir?
Yep. That's a very important question. I also brought out the ethics part when I was giving the example of India against Balochistan. Although the Prime Minister himself gave an indication on one of the Red Fort lectures a couple of years back. But I'm just saying that the ethics is a very major issue in this entire affair. In fact, the ethics in connection with cyber itself has been undergoing discussion for a long time. But let's talk of ethics. What are the types of ethical questions which come up when we are talking of cognitive warfare, right? So, starting from the simplest, we talked of broadcast media being used to peddle narratives and what is happening in the Ukraine conflict, etc., etc. you know the European Union in the very first couple of days of conflict had banned Russia Today and Sputnik Today, etc., from being streamed on European platforms, right? And thereafter there were counteractions, etc., YouTube being banned from Russia and so on and so forth. So these are examples. These are so-called saviors, or who swear by freedom of expression, democracies, who in the very first couple of days of conflict had banned Russia Today. So that's one angle to it. That is of course a foreign media banning in your own country, but is it warranted? That's one ethical question. What about your banning of, or let's say controlling the media of your own country to send out favorable narratives in your own national media? So most would consider that this is an acceptable activity. I would say If, let's say, we are at war with another country, and we are trying to, one side, let's not say we or somebody else, any one nation who's trying to propagate its story using its media, even though it is half truth. There's a Chinese saying, a half truth is as good as a whole lie. So if you're giving only part of the story and not giving the other part, then that's a half truth. And that half truth is as good as a whole lie. So credibility, what has happened in the Ukraine context. So in our own context, one has to have a national view on this. Do we, in maybe during the gray zone, because gray zone itself, the effects of cognitive warfare are taking place. So if we are a lot of free speech activists are bringing up this question, why are these apps being banned? Why are certain YouTube accounts being banned? Now no explanation is given. There is no transparency. So all these free speech activists, freedom of expression activists, so to say, even Supreme Court, for example, has given certain rulings in terms of freedom of speech, etc., etc. So, so this aspect is free. You see what is happening in our states, for example. Certain journalists happening. So there is a tension between national security requirements on the one hand and freedom of speech requirements on the other. There's a natural tension between that. Where the balance is drawn needs to be seen. To what extent do we control the freedom of broadcast media? And together with that, the journalists which go along with that. That's the first ethical question. And every nation will draw a balance in its own manner. So authoritarian states will draw it much closer to much more control of media, and absolutely, democratic states will draw it another, and other people will draw it somewhere in between. So this is the first ethical question which comes up. I'm only throwing up the questions. Where the lines are drawn is a national prerogative. Next, coming to psychological operations against domestic media. Many people use the word. In fact, one of our Indian armed forces doctrines also, I think, inadvertently, or you meaning, using the term psychological operations in a more generic sense, says that psychological operations are carried out against foreign as well as domestic audiences, is what the doctrine. The doctrine is in the open domain. That's why I'm quoting it. It's a 2007 joint doctrine on perception management. It makes this statement, but probably it's using the term psychological operations to mean the credible dissemination of information through broadcast media. That's what probably it means. Terminology. That's why it's so important to define terminology. So, but would you like to use psychological operations, feed your domestic populations with false information? In even in terms of national emergencies, let's say we are at war with China, would you want to feed your own population with false narratives also, or even half truths, because it fits the national security objective? That's an ethical question which needs to be answered. And again, a line will be drawn by a nation wherever it wishes to, right? So, psychological operations. I'm going to take the example of, for example, JNK. That's a, there's a segment of hostile population within JNK. So, do we use some psyops techniques also there? Yeah, but it's a domestic audience, so it's a very tricky question to be answered, and a mind has to be applied and a national decision taken on such issues. It's a national issue perspective. Then cognitive warfare against adversary populations. Now I gave the example of uh, us disrupting a society like Balochistan aggression. We fan the societal fault lines in an adversary country to achieve our political objective. What is that political objective? To keep Pakistan destabilized. Now this is an example from Indian side. On the reverse side, Pakistan does the same to us by fanning the flames of Khalistan, right? So there's an ethical question involved here. Warfare. Okay, we are also reaching the end of our time too, so I'll keep it short. I'm saying warfare in traditional terms, international law, when we talk of warfare, uh, combatants are supposed to fight combatants and even kill them, and that is justified under certain conditions. It is justified, right? That's called jus ad bellum, justified war, right? But here you are targeting civilians because whole societies are involved. And by disrupting societies, by exploiting those fault lines, there could be deaths also because of riots, etc., whatever happens. So, this is an ethical question to be answered. Or do we fight with our hands tied behind our backs that the adversary is doing to us, but we won't do it because of our moral stance? A big ethical question to be answered by at the national level, right? Then, of course, the question of neuro weapons. So, creation of super soldiers, even if you're enhancing the capabilities of your own soldiers through artificial means, through neuroscience and technology, is that an ethical thing to do? A lot of people will say, no, it's not ethical to do it. What happens when the soldiers come back to society? They become superhumans within, because they've got super capabilities now,
Hmm.
right? That's another ethical question to be answered. And should we target through neuro weapons, through biological warfare? There are conventions, international conventions that you're not supposed to, and we all
Yeah.
signed up for that. Chemical warfare, biological warfare, which target neural activity, they're already banned. But there are many aspects which are not. So maybe new international conventions will come up. But I'm just saying that this is another ethical question to be answered. And then, of course, I talked about international law, that while certain regimes, like for example, biological, chemical, etc., there are already conventions existing, although they also need to be improved. In other cases, especially in terms of information weapons and all this, the first part of cognitive warfare, which you talked about, it will take a very, very long time for even in cyber aspects, which is much more relevant. Discussions have been going on for the last 20 years, and all that has been achieved in the cyber context. Ethics in the cyber context are a set of principles. So no convention is there in cyber warfare. In cognitive domain, it will be much more difficult for international consensus to build up, because it's a much more nebulous sort of a thing if one comes to think of it in a deep manner. So that's what I'll say about the legal and ethical issues.
Basically, I mean, I'm sorry, but the entire thing doesn't make sense because the legality of these actions is always going to be in question, no matter what will be. Because, and that's just my personal thing, because at the end of it, you will be questioned and you will be brought to bear with regards to any sort of action that you've taken with regards to any civilian population, and that's something that we see. Um, More so if it's internal, so that's that's something which is a blurry line. I'm going to be short and crisp in my last question. So what should India do?
Yep. So I've already indicated certain aspects which are questions to be answered, but just to highlight the concrete actions which major players are taking in the to develop cognitive capabilities, I'd again like to flash a couple of slides. It'll take just a couple of minutes. Right. So, very briefly, if you look at the United States, it has got a US Special Operations Command, and it has got for a long time. I mean, it's been the PSYOPs groups, fourth and eighth PSYOPs groups, consisting of several PSYOPs battalions. So, large resource the armed forces itself has got, and it was the first one to come up with information operations doctrines, which talked of psyop and information your PI, what I referred to, etc., etc., inform influence operations. So a lot of doctrines it came up with, and of course it has been active in the cognitive domain openly as far as operations against ISIS are concerned. Very briefly, I'm saying China, for example, came up with a strategic support force where
mm,
cyber, electronic warfare, cognitive or psychological operations, and space all have been brought together as a potent strategic support force. In addition, it has got the United Front Work Department. It has got Confucius Institutes, more than 500 Confucius Institutes all across the world to disseminate their narratives. So, huge amount. There's also a public work department under the CMC, which is there. So, huge amount of resource is being spent. And I have talked about the Chinese Brain Project. Pakistan, we keep hearing about the ISI and the ISPR. What probably one doesn't know is that ISPR has got roughly 4,000 people working purely in the cognitive domain with a budget of several thousand crores per year. That's the type of resource which Pakistan. That's why it's so good at cognitive warfare. It may not be so good in the other information domains as cyber, etc. But in terms of cognitive warfare, it is very strong. We keep saying ISI this and ISI that. Of course, doctrinal wise, it is not very, and it's a Kashmir centric agenda. So these are the capabilities I've brought out United States, and I brought out both our adversaries, what they are devoting to it. So, what does India need to do? So, what are the which are the various ministries involved? I don't know whether you can see this slide. Essentially, we are talking of firstly the Ministry of External Affairs also comes into the picture because of the diplomacy part. The Ministry of Home Affairs comes into the picture because
internal
of
security.
the protection part. Ministry of Home Affairs is an IS looking organization, but if there are cognitive operations taking place against our own population, it's the Ministry of Home Affairs, which will be the primary acting agency for it. The armed forces are involved for the military information operations. Should they be involved in the other aspects of it, like societal fault lines? If not the armed forces, who else? There's no other agency which I can think of. I can think of. So you have, for example, agencies like the RAW, right? So, but it's an open question. Nobody is really given. So, like Pakistan has the ISPR, it's a military organization. China has got the SSF in addition to civilian organizations. So, so the and of course the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting is involved in the entire because the broadcast media comes into the picture even for credible information as part of cognitive operations. So all these agencies are involved, and how should the entire thing be coordinated and controlled? So there has to be an apex body to look purely at cognitive operations as a synergized affair. Today, such a body doesn't appear to exist. There are activities which are taking place. After all, when apps are banned and things take place, it doesn't happen out of the blue. Somebody is working on it, right? But in my own personal opinion, the expertise part of it. So proper organizations need to be created, resource developed, and expertise developed in the right disciplines. Like I said, a mix of cognitive and cyber expertise is required for proper conduct of cognitive operations. And for the armed forces, I would say that just like we raised a defense cyber agency for looking at cyber operations, which I have always been recommending that it should be upgraded to a cyber command, we should at least start with raising a defense cognitive operations agency which can act as a fulcrum for developing cognitive expertise within the armed forces for whatever role it is required to do, right? And the third major recommendation which I have is that uh, you saw India's name was missing in the brain initiative, etc. So we should focus on development of neuro weapons just like the other major powers are doing.
Mm,
So
mm,
these are the
mm.
three main recommendations which I have on what India should be doing.
So one of the biggest things that you are bringing out is basically these. I mean, it's this subject has kind of put me into a lot of thought because what is happening around us today. You can kind of relate. I mean, it's obviously a very technical subject, but when you look at it piecemeal, you can relate to stuff which is happening around us, and that's something which is important for us to understand. So, for anybody to literally understand the entire subject as a whole, up to the level that you're talking about, is something. If we're able to do it, I think that's going to be the best thing in the world because the disinformation and the misinformation which is being put out will be able to be addressed. Having said that, sir, one interesting thing I'd like to say, and that's something which I learned mostly as a punchline, if I may, is that the uh, the idea of having someone modify a thought process is not new. It's been on since the 60s, and you mentioned about those drug programs and stuff like that. So it's a whole new different paradigm that we are dealing with today, and it needs to be understood. So that's a lot of people may say, "Yaar, ye to abhi start hua hai." This is not now. It's been there for a long time, and that's to me is something as a bottom line. So it's a part of our life. It happens to us when we are probably buying anything on Amazon, for that matter, because the minute we search for it, we start getting ads and stuff like that. So it's influencing you to buy something. It's a common general behavior that is being influenced. So that's something which is very interesting in a general person's life. Also, he'll be able to figure this out. And a lot of people would agree with me. You search for holidays in Goa, and for the next 5 days on Facebook or Instagram, every time you open, you get ads for resorts in Goa or flights in Goa, or stuff like that. So it's basically an influence operation right there at a very basic level, which is dealt with advertising and this and that and the whole thing. So it's a very large
Shall I
subject. Sir, please.
shall I just add a small comment here that uh, when you we keep quoting Chinese, etc., three warfares. I think I didn't mention the three warfares. They've got a three warfare strategy for cognitive operations, which has been manifested in the strategic support force and other organizations. I talked of the dime paradigm,
Hmm.
not diplomacy, information, military, and economic. So we have, you must have heard of Sam, Dam, Dan, Bhed, our
Nandbed.
own, that Sam is diplomacy, Samjhauta, diplomacy. Dam is finance. Dand is the military part, the kinetic part. And Bhed is a portion of the information part. Bhed is how you create dissension. In fact, it directly relates to cognitive operations. Why I'm bringing this out is that if we go into our own cultural heritage, so to say, and the expertise that we have in our own, literature and own history that we've been having, we'll find a lot of material which is very deep, which supports this field of cognitive operations. I'm not an expert, but I'm pretty sure the way I know our the depth and breadth of Indian scriptures and all our literature and the knowledge that is encapsulated everywhere, that you'll find great knowledge there to be able to support cognitive operations thinking.
Oh, true, sir. I mean, that's something that there is no question. I think we've forgotten our history in many an aspects, not just this. Uh, when we are very impressed when we read Sun Tzu's line, and he says, "Yeah, defeat an enemy before the war starts," and this and that and everything. But most of the stuff is pretty much the same, or I don't know. I'm not going to go ahead and say they copied it from us and stuff like that, but that's going a little extreme without having any
Evidence, yeah.
evidence for it. But having said that, it is pretty much the same, and these are two very age-old societies, very age-old civilizations. I'm sure people are learning the similar lessons as we are today in every country of the world. So I guess there's a lot of similarity to the entire game.
Yeah.
Sir, it's thank you so much for one actually sharing the slides. They were very explanatory in terms of what the subject was, because it's a very technical game, and one tried to read about it, it just went so it's not something that one can understand, because the only aspect of it I guess a common man understands is social media trends. आज ट्विटर में क्या ट्रेंड चल रहा है, and that's something which people do
Yeah.
understand. So it's a larger subject. I'd like to thank you once again for bringing this up with us and taking this through with me. um, till next time, sir, for another subject on another day and an intriguing discussion. As always, sir. Jai Hind.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me over here.
Thank you, sir.
Jai Hind.